Welcome to the Daily Plunge. We are in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. Paul is speaking to a group of folks who are ambitious entrepreneurs. Corinth is sort of a boomtown. And these folks are big into self-promotion, and they're projecting onto Paul that he's the same way. And so here he humble brags, and he says, it is by God's mercy, by God's pity that he even calls me as a disciple. And he calls me to this ministry. So we don't lose heart because he's using us for his purpose. And I would ask you, what is your ministry in your life that God is working through you to do? Wherever it is in your life. Now, Paul goes on, it says, we don't use deception. We don't distort the word of God. We've renounced all shameful practices because we're not trying to trick people into the gospel. And in fact, we ask you to look at us. Look at what our lives are like. We're nothing fancy. We're nothing special. We are carrying out our ministry with integrity and honesty. And so he goes on in verse 3 to say, that everyone can see who we are plainly in the sight of God. And if our gospel looks veiled, it's not because the gospel is veiled. It's because people's hearts are hardened to the gospel. That they're the people who hold on to the death of this world. And so the God of this age has blinded them from seeing the good news of Jesus Christ and the displays of Christ that are happening in the life of Paul and the other ministry leaders. And so he goes on. He says, we're not promoting ourselves. We're preaching Jesus Christ, crucified and risen as the Lord of life. And we present ourselves as your servants, not your masters. We're here so that you would come to faith. And then he goes on in verse 6. He says, the God who said, let light shine out of the darkness, is doing that same thing in us. That out of our own dark lives of brokenness and sin, the light of the gospel is shining through, so that the light of knowing God is displayed in us and in the face of Christ. He goes on in verse 7, and this is one of my favorite verses. We have this treasure, this amazing treasure in earthen vessels, so that it can be seen that the overwhelming, outstanding, extraordinary, all-surpassing power belongs not to us, but comes from God. And that's so true for the church, is that it's never about us. It's what God is doing through us. And then Paul goes on in verses 8 and 9. He says, we're hard-pressed, we're crushed, we're perplexed, we're persecuted, we're struck down. But in all of these, it's not the end of him, because God is continuing to work even through the struggles of ministry and the struggles of this life, so that the power of God can be displayed. And then he goes on in verses 10 through 12 to say, that death is at work in us so that life can be at work in you. And what reminds us of what Jesus says is that as followers, we're called to pick up the cross, to deny ourselves and to die to this world so that the life of Christ can burst into our lives. Or as Paul says in Romans, we die to our sinful selves so the life of Christ can shine in us. And he says, this is happening in our lives so that you may come to the real life, the life of Jesus. Well, thanks, friends. Have a blessed day.